I'm going to begin with our scripture reading for this morning from Matthew 5:13-16. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how can its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything. It's thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hid, and no one lights a lamp and puts it under a basket, but instead they put it up on a lamp stand where it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good deeds and give glory to your Father in heaven. I think it's interesting and kind of optimistic that Jesus says, you are salt for the earth. You are the light of the world. I wonder sometimes how good a job I'm doing at that. But it seems really important to start with that. You are salt. You are light. Jesus didn't say, give it a shot. See if you can shake a little salt out there. And, maybe there's a little bit of light in you, but take care to make sure it keeps burning. It might get blown out or something. No, this is a very optimistic Jesus saying, I know who you are for the world. I know what's inside of you, and I want you to share it. Let's start with salt. Most of us probably take salt for granted. It's plentiful and it's cheap, and there's handfuls of extra salt on the bottom of pretzel bags that we can throw away or eat up and get sick. But in ancient times, salt was highly taxed. It was a valuable commodity, and wars were fought over rights over salt mines. Actually, our word salary has roots in the ancient Roman practice of actually paying Roman soldiers with salt rations, in part. Salt was so valuable for so many reasons. It was important for preservation. Before there was any refrigeration, you packed meat in salt. Salt was used to clean wounds. It was used for healing. It was also an important part of the ritual life for the Hebrew people. Every grain offering was to include the salt of the covenant. You read this in Leviticus chapter 2. And since the covenant was preserved for all time, an everlasting covenant, it's referred to in the Hebrew Bible as the covenant of salt. So salt is this valuable and necessary part of life in so many ways, not just an extra frill or a flavor, a luxury item to make the soup a little bit more pleasant. Salt is also necessary for human life. Each of us has about 4 or maybe 8 ounces of salt in our bodies. It helps to regulate the volume of our blood and the balance of water in our bodies. It affects our digestion and our heart function and our brains. Salt is a part of who we are. So I think Jesus, pulling out this salt metaphor, wants to tell his followers that our life with God and our lives with each other, the message of God's love that we bear, these are absolutely necessary for the life of the world. God's love in us, God's image in all creation. This is absolutely necessary for the life of the world. And Jesus' followers are to be reminders of that reality of God's love in the world. So, this is a necessary, basic element of life. We're not the hot sauce of the earth or the guacamole of the earth or even the ketchup or the curry of the earth. Salt goes a lot deeper. All salt, as you probably know, comes from the ocean or from a sea. But not all salt comes from the oceans that we know today. But there are vast salt mines and underground salt deposits from the time when the earth was covered with oceans. And these deposits, which provide pure salt deposits are found in every continent, from oceans that contained, we think, maybe 4.5 million cubic miles of salt. So salt is also very ancient. It's not something we just go to a factory and create. It comes from these ancient oceans that have covered the earth for millions and millions of years. So Jesus isn't either pulling out a novel new flavor. The message he calls us to live is not new or novel either. It's the eternal kindness and mercy of God, who is our source and our final destiny, our beginning and our end. Jesus is calling us back to what it means to be truly human. And like we talked about in the children's time, a little bit of this essence of God's image and life within us makes a big difference. There's this old story about Fiorello LaGuardia, who was a mayor in New York City 90 years ago, from 1934 to 1945. He was a pro-New Deal, liberal, progressive Republican. There's a story about one bitter, cold January night in 1935, and he went to a night court in one of the poorest sections of the city and decided to sit in for the judge. And soon after he came up to the bench, an old, half-frozen woman was brought in, and she had been charged with stealing a loaf of bread. The owner of the store refused to drop the charges. And when the mayor asked the woman why she had stolen the loaf of bread, she said that her daughter's husband had left, and they were living alone with the children, and the grandchildren were starving and in need of food, and that's why she did it. But the owner of the store said, this is a bad part of town. We can't just let this woman off. We have to give an example and say that this kind of behavior isn't tolerated. So the mayor said to the woman, look, I've got to punish you. The law doesn't make any exceptions. And so the punishment is 10 days in jail or a $10 fine. And as he was saying that, he was pulling a $10 bill out of his pocket, which he put down on the table and said, okay, that's the fine. Now I'm canceling it. And I'm going to fine everyone in this courtroom 50 cents for living in a neighborhood where an old woman has to steal bread to feed her grandchildren. So apparently, the next morning in the newspapers, they reported that $47.50 was turned over to a bewildered woman who had stolen a loaf of bread to feed her grandchildren. 50 cents of that amount had been contributed by the grocery store owner himself, along with about 70 petty criminals, people with traffic violations, and New York City policemen who had just paid 50 cents as well. And then they gave the mayor a standing ovation. Now, 85 years is a long time for a story like this to sort of take on legendary proportions. And I can't quite imagine a group of people in a courtroom standing up and cheering for a decision like that. But if they did stand up and cheer, it was probably because they knew, like we do, that the salt of human decency is desperately needed in our world. And we kind of know what that tastes like. We notice it when it happens. And it feels good and it feels right to be called back to our original flavor as humans made in God's image, called to care for each other and bound by the law of love. This image and character of God is part of all humans. And we believe that Jesus lived a true human life, full of God's Spirit and God's character, one with God, and that Jesus invites us to be filled with the Spirit, to be one with God, and to live as he did. This was Jesus' mission, to stir up the reign of God, to make God's love present and visible here and now, and to bring God to earth in a human life, and to let that life keep on living in us. The covenant of God with humans, preserved and passed on forever. So in Matthew chapter 5, right after this business about salt and light, Jesus immediately says, "Don't think that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets." No, not to abolish, but to fulfill. Jesus is having an ongoing conversation with other Jewish people about the law of Moses and about the Hebrew Scriptures. He's not talking about crime and punishment and the ethics of poverty in 20th century New York City or anywhere else. But I think what I like about this old LaGuardia in the courtroom story is that it feels like it gets to the spirit of law, the fulfillment of law at its human best, to support the common good, to protect the vulnerable, to enhance the flavor of human decency. Getting back to the ancient and basic truths that we're all made in God's image, called to love God and to care for each other. So if salt is who we are, why the warning from Jesus about salt losing its flavor? Becoming useless, trampled underfoot. Salt, you know, is an element, a compound, sodium chloride, made from sodium and chlorine. It's an extremely stable compound, and it can't really lose its flavor in that form. Once it's salt, it's always salt. But in the ancient world, salt, mined from these salt marshes, often contained many impurities. It was full of water and all kinds of diluted residue, which was worthless and was thrown out on the street or on the rooftop porches to be trampled underfoot. The real pure salt, as Jesus uses it as a metaphor for following him, is summed up in his teachings on the Scriptures in Matthew 22. Jesus is asked to sum up the law and the prophets, and he says, "Love the Lord your God with your heart and soul and mind and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself." That's the salt, the law fulfilled. Jesus claims to sum up the prophets, the Hebrew prophets as well. And this Matthew reading in our lectionary schedules is oftentimes paired up with a reading from the prophet Isaiah, Isaiah 58, 6 and 7, where God is speaking through the prophet about fasting. And God is saying, I don't want to have a fast that's just a ritual, that's just to make you look good. The passage says, "Is not this the fast I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to untie the heavy burden, Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them and not to hide yourself from your own kin. That's the salt. That's what Jesus is referring to later on in this passage in Matthew 5, in verse 20, when he says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of scribes and Pharisees, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. Jesus, I think, wants his followers to go beyond a kind of religion that focuses like a laser on correct belief and ritual purity and public decorum, looking good, staying clean, being polite, orthodox. Nothing wrong with any of that, but it's not the salt or the light that Jesus is talking about. The useless salt that has no flavor, it may be Jesus making a reference to scammers, ancient scammers who sold salt that wasn't any good. Stuff that they called salt, just a thin layer of salt cut with chalk or other stuff, bulked up with all kinds of useless filler, not really salt. Actually, some of you, I'm sure, know more about chemistry than I do, but we do know enough to know that sodium or chlorine by themselves can be pretty dangerous before you put them together to make salt. Dangerous like a religious life focused only on beliefs and creeds and doctrines on the one hand, or dangerous like a life focused only on good works, designed to earn points with the universe. I wonder if any of you have seen the NBC comedy The Good Place. A couple of you have. It's an interesting show about some people who wind up in the afterlife, and it's an afterlife where there is this elaborate point system that determines whether a person gets to go to the good place or the bad place. It's extremely simplistic theologically, and it's a silly premise. But it leads to some really interesting conversation about how, after all, the scorekeeping turns out to be kind of bogus. How do we become better humans? Is it ever too late? And what is it that really makes us good? There's some similar tension in this gospel teaching between the warning not to lose our flavor and the call to let the light shine on the one hand. We have to share the flavor of salt. We have to shine our light on the one hand. And then on the other hand, the basic reality and the ultimate hope that we are made in God's image. We already bear the light of God, and God is restoring all creation to this image. The tension is between who we are and what Jesus is still calling us to become. So, sodium chloride salt can't really lose its flavor, but it can be wasted. It can be taken for granted. It can be misused. Marcia Riggs writes, the danger is we may lose that capacity, she says, to humanize life on earth. She also says to elicit goodness. We may lose the capacity to elicit goodness by forgetting that we are, followers of Jesus, we are to disorder the status quo by valuing the dispossessed, caring for those who suffer loss, showing mercy, having integrity, being peacemakers, and courageously standing up for what we believe. When the early Anabaptist reformers insisted that the church of Jesus should be visible, shining light being visible in the world, living out the gospel in specific ways that bring healing and hope. But ways that may also cause us to get in trouble. This was the most memorable quote from Pastor Debbie last week, and you might have been quoting someone else, but she said, "Love your enemies, but for God's sake, have some." At City Church, one of the ways you have lived out the flavors of God's kindness and truth is through your visible and public statement of welcome and affirmation toward our LGBTQ friends and family and neighbors. A practice that seeks to restore full humanity to us all by affirming that we're all loved and gifted by God. Your statement and the theology and relationships and commitment that it grows out of are a visible light, a noticeable flavor, a public statement that makes a noticeable difference in the community. Thank you for naming God's inclusion as a basic part, just a basic part of Christian witness in the name and spirit of Jesus, as a preserving and healing and cleansing spiritual element that's desperately needed in our churches and in our world and in our community. I gather that there have been pains and frustrations along with this commitment, consequences you've faced for shining that particular light, and I don't know or claim to understand all the ways that this experience of visibility crossed over into some of your personal lives and stories. But Jesus said, "Those who hunger and thirst for righteousness will be filled, and the merciful will be shown mercy." And I think that promise may be enacted in these kinds of experiences. I come from a Mennonite background, and I'm learning some about the Church of the Brethren, but I still don't know too much. Pastor Bev said to me a couple of times, just trying to give me a thumbnail, that Brethren theology is kind of like a mixture of Anabaptism and Pietism. And without a church history or a theology lesson, I think what she meant was it's sort of a balance between discipleship and spirituality. Or maybe even more simply, a balance between shining our light and sharing the flavor of salt and also trusting and enjoying the reality of God's love and light that is within us, and that is part of who we are. You are salt of the earth. You are light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under a bowl, but instead puts it up on a stand, so it gives light to everyone. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so they may see your good work and give glory to God in heaven.